Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to creepyMypasta, where I share the spookiest and most chilling true stories from Reddit. In today's video, we're diving into some first-hand encounters that people have had with the strange and unexplained. I'll keep the intro short because I'm excited to jump right into these terrifying tales. So stick around, each story is well worth the listen. And before we start, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It really helps out, and I'd be super grateful. Alright, without further ado, let's get into today's collection of Reddit horror stories.
I watched my coworker get arrested and then found out he had a sinister plan for me. I worked with this man for a little over 3 years. We worked pretty closely on some projects over the last 2 years and even sat near one another at work. In September I showed up and saw about 10 detectives at my place of work. I was a bit startled as this was quite unusual for my area. I looked around and saw that my coworker was in handcuffs and looked quite disheveled, which wasn't out of the norm to be honest. I walked up to the detectives, introduced myself and let them know who I was in relation to him. I asked what was going on and they filled me in on why he was currently being arrested. For the sake of the case, I won't share more than he was a disgusting person. Over the course of the next 3 hours, I watched as they dismantled his workstation, went through his belongings, took evidence pictures and so on. I was pulled in and out of rooms answering questions about his character, what I knew of him and my feelings about him as a person. I told them he gave me a weird feeling in my gut. That I've always told my husband I wouldn't be surprised if the cops ever did come looking for him. That my husband even thought he was weird, and if I ever went missing that he'd be the first person to be suspected. Didn't realize how real this almost was. The detective on site told me that they served a search warrant at his home and were looking there for any evidence. It sounds like they found more than they anticipated and were looking to see if there was anything else, unrelated to what they were currently investigating. I was asked my name and my husband's name for confirmation for something they found, which I did think was odd, but I let it go and called my husband to update him on the happenings of the day thus far. However, the last hour I was pulled in for the final time and advised by one of the lead detectives, who couldn't even look at me, that I needed to ensure I was safe and protected in the event they didn't book him that day. Come to find out, he had been journaling about me over the course of at least a year. Saying he wanted to be with me, but the problem was that I was married. His journal then lined out a plan to set my husband up for cheating on me. And the end resulted in my death, caused by him, my coworker. The officer said that everything in between was more vile than he's ever heard, to the point he was crying when he was telling me to make sure I was safe, crying. A detective and didn't want to scare me. Thankfully, he was charged and at looking at a long time in prison. But I still think about it. It keeps me up at night. It just shows you never really know someone, even your coworkers. Story number 2. The moment I realized how naive I am. I work night shifts at a liquor store. There are some customers who come and ask for almond chocolate, nothing else, and walk away. I asked my manager to order more almond chocolates since it's highly requested at night. My manager seemed surprised. During the day they barely sell any almond chocolate. One night an odd guy walks in, asks for almond chocolate. I reply, I'm sorry, we are out. Then he starts crying. He is going items frantically. He says I need aluminum foil now. I ask him to leave the store. I sit down to relax and I Google aluminum foil and almond chocolate. Turns out they do drugs using the aluminum foil. It's well known in the drug community chocolates with nuts are wrapped in foil to prevent turning stale. My fat ass would have never thought someone is more excited about the wrapping than the chocolate. Story number 3. My horrifying experience at Lake Tahoe, summer of 2021. I'm 15 at the time. My family and I decided to finally take a vacation. We didn't travel much, so the idea of going somewhere nearby yet otherworldly was thrilling. Our destination: Lake Tahoe. The trip began like any other. We drove from Western California to the northern shores of the lake. Everything was perfect, almost. The whole family was there, except my father, who would join us later because of work. The next morning, we went to the lake for some swimming. The Nevada side of the North Shore was stunning. Afterward, we returned to our cozy little Airbnb cabin. The following day, we revisited the same beach. This time, my uncle introduced us to some rocks he'd discovered for cliff jumping. He and his wife paddled us to the area using their boards. The rocks were nestled in a secluded cove, only accessible by water. It was exhilarating, climbing and leaping into the deep, cold lake. One rock stood out, a giant, far into the lake. Too distant and daunting for us to attempt. Still, we made a mental note of it before paddling back to shore. Later that afternoon, my father finally arrived. We excitedly recounted our rock-jumping adventure, and he seemed especially eager to try. Everyone else was too tired, so it was just me and him. Without a paddleboard, we would have to swim from rock to rock. At first, it was simple: swim, climb, jump, repeat. Then my father, ever the daredevil, pushed me to tackle the massive rock far out in the lake. I hesitated but didn't want to show fear, so I agreed. The swim to the big rock felt endless. I was usually a strong swimmer, but something about that stretch was unnerving, like the lake was pulling me down. When we finally reached it, the jagged surface was hard to climb. My dad hoisted me up, and together we stood on top. The rock was even larger up close, towering above the water. He volunteered to jump first. Watching him leap felt surreal. He fell for what seemed like ages before hitting the water with a resounding slap. Then, nothing. Seconds stretched painfully. He didn't surface. My chest tightened, panic creeping in. Suddenly, he emerged, gasping, his face a ghostly shade of pale. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice cracking. He looked up, his expression strained, almost hollow, before forcing a weak smile. "Yeah," he laughed nervously. "Big jump, huh?" His laugh didn't reach his eyes. Still, he insisted I jump too. Reluctantly, I did. The drop wasn't as terrifying as I'd expected, but something about the water felt wrong. Cold, heavy, almost alive. When I resurfaced, my dad was frantically urging me to hurry back. His desperation was contagious. We swam back in silence, his pace feverish. When we returned to the beach, my dad pulled my mother and grandparents aside. Their hushed conversation grew tense, their faces darkening. I sat alone, confused, until sirens wailed in the distance. Minutes later, an ambulance and police cars arrived at the beach parking lot. The trip continued uneventfully after that. Or so I thought. It wasn't until 2 years later that I learned the truth, what my father had seen beneath the surface of that massive rock. A body. Bloated, lifeless, drifting in the shadows below. To this day, he refuses to talk about it. We haven't been back to Tahoe. And we never will. Story number 4. I think my kid's father killed one, maybe 2 people. So, yeah, here's my theory. I'd love to hear your thoughts because this story might have a few parts. I'm 44 now, but when I was 15, I started dating a boy I'll call Jack. We ended up having 3 kids together, 4 in total. Our first child came when I was 17, and Jack was 16. We married, but after 10 years, we divorced. Now, let me give you a little background on Jack. He was the youngest of 3. His mother had Jack and his sister, but his older brother was from a different relationship. Jack's mom was an alcoholic, and eventually, her drinking caught up to her. She was in a near-fatal car crash that left her paralyzed from the waist down. After that, she used a cane to walk. During her recovery, Jack's aunt, Carolyn, who was more like a mother figure, took Jack and his sister in. From the time Jack and I started dating, he was always addicted to something: drugs, pills, sex, cheating, video games, you name it. He was always spiraling into some kind of addiction. And let me tell you, Jack was abusive. I never saw him be abusive to his mom or Carolyn, but I witnessed his abuse toward me and every other woman he was with after me. In fact, the girl he's with now, He's nearly killed her several times. His wife after me. He once locked her in a trunk and threatened to drown her in a lake near their house. He's toxic to his kids too. To this day, my children want nothing to do with him. They might speak to him briefly if they have to, but they avoid him whenever possible. I haven't been around Jack in years, but about 8 years ago, I started dating someone who was acquaintances with him. So, over the past few years, I've found myself in situations where I've crossed paths with Jack, nothing major. Just quick encounters when my boyfriend needed to help him with something related to his car. A while back, my kids told me something strange about the time Jack's Aunt Carolyn passed away. Oddly enough, Jack told my boyfriend and me the same story during one of those brief encounters. To this day, I can't stop running the scenario through my head because I know Jack too well, and there's definitely more to this story. Carolyn was the woman who took care of Jack and his sister when his mom was recovering from the wreck. She was always close to him, especially after her husband died. From what I know, he didn't pass away long after getting out of prison for murder, but I don't know all the details. Jack seemed to be close to Carolyn when she passed, so when he said he hadn't heard from her in a few days, it made me wonder about their relationship. Carolyn was an alcoholic too, but she kept to herself about it and didn't bother anyone, at least that's how I remembered it. Jack said that when he hadn't heard from her in a while, he went to check on her. He drove to her house, about a 15-minute drive, and when he got there, she didn't answer the door. So, he said he broke a window to get in. Once inside, he found her on the floor, unlived. He said she had wrapped a phone cord around her neck. Then, he took a picture of her body and sent it to my kids. They confirmed this, before calling the police. But here's the kicker, before calling them, he supposedly searched her house and found her prescription pain pills. The police came, ruled it a suicide, and moved on. But here's the thing, can someone really strangle themselves with a phone cord? It doesn't seem physically possible. And knowing the police department where I live, I wouldn't trust them to investigate it thoroughly. They're lazy and corrupt. But what really gets me is the position he said her body was in, one hand on one side, and the other on the opposite side. That just doesn't add up. Doesn't your body fight to survive, to resist when you're trying to take your own life? It doesn't sit right with me, and I can't shake the feeling that something else happened. And then, the saga continues, another person ends up gone. To be continued. This story is 100% true and I've been wanting to share for a long time to get others' thoughts on the situation. Story number 5. I met a killer. One time when I was 18, I took the Greyhound from Arizona to Washington to visit my then girlfriend now ex. Got to talking with the guy sitting next to me. Our small talk made him get comfortable and he ended up confessing that the reason he was on that Greyhound was because he was on the run from the law. Explained that he did home evasion. The last one ended with him taking out the people with a shotgun. The cops showed up while he was fleeing and he shot at them, too narrowly escaping. I made sure to keep a calm composure and he ended up getting off early at the next stop. Thankfully I never seen him again. Story number 6. I saw death and the man it took. 11 years ago, my family and I lived in an extended stay hotel for a while until we saved up enough to get a place. It was a 1-bedroom with 2 sleeping areas, a kitchenette, and bathroom. Some people had lived there for over 10 years by the time we moved there. We made friends with some of the people on the various floors, as well as a couple of the managers. It wasn't home per se, but it was better than being homeless. A few doors down from our room lived an older gentleman who had a young adult son who would visit him maybe once a week. One day, my best friend and I had returned to the hotel from shopping and hanging out. As we pulled into the large driveway, I saw a dark figure looking up at the hotel. It looked like a man and was all black. As we passed it, it looked back at us driving by. I couldn't see its eyes but could still feel it looking. I turned away quickly, feeling a bit of dread in my spirit. I told my friend, "I think I just saw death." Surprisingly, he replied that he had seen it as well and even pointed to the exact spot where it had been standing. We both looked at one another and remained silent for a minute. I said a quick prayer, asking God to watch over my family and the people in the hotel. A couple days later, there was some commotion in the hallway. My parents and I investigated and found out that the older gentleman that lived in the room a few doors down had died the day before. His son couldn't get him on the phone and had come over. He wouldn't open the door, worried. He had the manager open the door and they found his father deceased. It took a few hours before they had the older gentleman's body removed from the room. Later that day I left the room to sit in the back stairwell to have a private conversation with my good friend that lives in another state. I saw an older man walking slowly down the stairs. He was wearing blue. When he heard me, he looked up at me sadly as I looked down at him. To my shock I realized only his top portion was visible. He turned back around, kept walking down the stairs and disappeared. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe we all have a spirit or what some call a soul. I've also experienced my fair share of strange and supernatural events in my almost 40 years of life. I had seen death before and I've seen other things I've shared on here, but that was my first time seeing a spirit leaving to the other side. Story number 7. Baby in belly saved me from something despicable happening to me. So this happened about 7 years ago when I was 6 months pregnant. I was a teen mom who had just gotten off school and I got home to take my usual afternoon nap. Before I did I talked with my mom about some dinner plans and she had told me she's going out to get something she needed for the food we were going to cook, so I walked to my room as she was getting ready to head out and I fell fast asleep. When not even 20 minutes I had the urge to pee and I got up from bed, and that's when I hear something in the kitchen and I assumed it was my mom already back. As soon as I was about to turn the doorknob my daughter moved into a position that made me not need to pee as bad and I just held it in to get a bit more sleep. I woke up 10 minutes later to a loud noise in living room and I go to check it out thinking my mom had an accident, but turns out the entire house was empty. And that noise was the glass door out back shutting. I started shaking because I was so confused I swore I heard my mom in the kitchen earlier, but it wasn't her. We had just been robbed while I was in my room the entire time. They took everything, all our savings and TVs and consoles. In just 30 minutes. Like, that's crazy to me to think how it all happened in such short time while I was just asleep so peacefully. I called 911 and they got there pretty quickly and they said there was no sign of a break-in, that the door was unlocked and that I'm lucky to be alive because they saw a muddy footprint right outside of my bedroom door. Who knows if they were staring at me while I slept or if they were waiting for me to come out. What would have happened if I gotten out? Story number 8. I think I almost got kidnapped. Earlier this year, when I was still 14, I was walking home from my friend's house. It was around sunset, but I was on a relatively popular street, so I wasn't too anxious. As I was walking, a man holding a grocery bag stopped me. It was an older man a few inches taller than me. I immediately got nervous, as I don't really interact with people well. The man said something along the lines of, "Hey, will you take this bag down to that guy down there?" I didn't see a guy, and I immediately got a bad gut feeling, so I wasn't about to take a bag from a random man. Because I was so nervous, I kind of stumbled around my words, but I said no in a shaky voice and apologized. I walked away as fast as I could, and about 20 feet away from this man, the direction I was walking, I saw a white van parked on the side of the street with another younger, but middle-aged, man with his leg out of the car as if he was about to step out. I am a generally paranoid person, so I'm not sure if I might have made an unfair assumption, but this really creeped me out. On the rest of my walk, which was mostly down the same street, I couldn't stop looking behind me, but the man just stood there with the bag looking at me. I called my gram and asked her to pick me up, and now I always keep my guard up when I go out alone. Story number 9. Whistling at 1:30 a.m. So, I got home from my boyfriend's house around 1:30 a.m. on Friday. I parked my car down the road from my house since we don't have space. As I get to my walkway to the front door of my house I hear a short 1 to 2 whistle. Not like wolf whistling, but a very quick one, like when you're trying getting someone's attention. I stop and look around and I can't see anyone or hear anyone moving. I'm pretty familiar with my neighbors. We're in a small dead-end street and in the 10 years we've lived here they've never done this sort of thing, so I think I can rule them out. Anyway, as I go up to the top step of the landing, I hear the whistle again. I stop, look around and again I see and hear nothing. I felt my heart start to race lol and I turn my back to put my key in the door. And as I'm putting my key in the lock, I hear the FKN whistle again, but it sounded closer or like it came from a slightly different direction. Still from behind me, but closer to where I was. I have never opened my door so fucking fast. I peeked through the windows to the side and still couldn't see who it could have been. Next day, I tell my family and boyfriend over dinner about the whistling. And they all said, oh, it's that bird. That noisy bird. And yes, there is a noisy bird in our area that makes noise at day and night. However, it's not a whistle as such, it does more of a high-pitched tune that goes for like 2 to 3 seconds. It's a distinct noise and it sounds nothing like a normal whistle. And OFC, I can distinguish the two because I've heard this bird all day every day for a few months now. Fast forward to this morning, my mum messages me and says my sister heard whistling last night. Before she could send her next message, I said, if you're going to say it's a bird, it's not. She said my sister told her it definitely came from a person and it was like a song. But not that bird we were talking about. It was a person. My sister said she heard it at 4 a.m. and thought someone was in the house, it was that clear, and wanted to scream but was too scared. Maybe it's a new bird that's flown to our neighborhoods. But in the years we've been here, no one in the family has mentioned any creepy things like whistling in the night. And for it to happen a couple times within the space of 1 week. Man. Weird. If anyone has heard of similar stuff happening in the middle of the night like this, let me know. Update. I heard the whistling last night. But not the initial whistle from a week ago. I heard the sing-song whistle that my sister heard. It was loud and clear enough to wake me from my sleep around 3:30 a.m. I sat up and stopped to listen and it was a tune. I tried to hear if it was a song, and then maybe I could recognize it. It was not anything I recognized. It was so creepy hearing it so clearly. I can't believe I woke up from it. It didn't sound like it was coming from inside, but very close to my house outside on my side of the house. I told my mom and now she's all freaked out because 2 of us have heard it. What if someone is lurking around the house, and all that? My dad, being big strong macho man nothing scares me, is telling us it's the neighbors or birds and to relax. Now can I be scared? Story number 10. I will never understand. When I was probably 9 or 10, we were on a road trip up the East Coast headed to Connecticut. We stopped at a rest stop and my family members were grabbing snacks and I decided to head to the bathroom. The rest stop was off of a highway, I do not remember at all what state, but somewhere in between PA and Connecticut. The rest stop was extremely big but still normal. There were different places to get food like Subway and etc. in the inside. I was trying to find the bathroom and I found myself in a totally different section of the rest stop. Things started to look older and a little vacant. I was walking through doors and then I went into this door in a weird empty room and what I walked into was unexplainable. But here I go. I remember when I walked into the room it looked like a disco show sort of. All of the lights were going with rainbow colors, waiters were walking around serving drinks and there were a bunch of round tables with people playing bingo. The floors were like the old speckled bowling alley floors. It almost felt like I walked into a completely different time period. The weirder part is, the only people making any sort of movement were the waiters. Everyone sitting at these tables were in wheelchairs, like mechanical wheelchairs that looked like Abby Lee's. The people in the wheelchairs were mannequins. Or at least they looked like mannequins. They looked like frozen rock-hard people, although they were very realistic looking. The image of these mannequins is ingrained in my head and explaining it to people is so hard. It was almost like these waiters were playing with the mannequins like dolls. But it was the craziest setup. The mannequins had over-the-top makeup and wigs on. All of their arms were propped up on the round tables with bingo cards placed in some of their hands. I know what I saw, I know this happened, this was not a dream. As a kid this scarred me for some reason and I never stopped thinking about it. I walked out and went right to the car because my family had already gotten back in the car. I never said a word to my family about it at the time. This is still something I don't understand. I posted this in a different subreddit and got so much hate for it. I know this sounds crazy, but it is still something to this day I cannot explain. What do you guys think I saw? What was that? Has anyone heard of anything similar? Story number 11. Until I woke up. This happened when I was around 12. My family and I had traveled to Malaysia to visit relatives who lived in Sarawak. My family is known for their deep spiritual beliefs and rich traditions. Stories of spirits and supernatural encounters were common in our household, passed down through generations. Almost everyone in my family had a tale of an encounter, be it a whisper in the night or a shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Me, being a skeptic at that age, thought these stories were just ways to scare kids into behaving. One of my uncles ran a small money transfer business, exchanging foreign currency for Malaysian ringgit. His work often took him to nearby neighboring cities, like Cebu or Selangor, and I looked up to him so much that I'd tag along whenever he let me. One night, during a family dinner, my uncle mentioned he needed to meet a business partner in Cebu the following week. He asked if I wanted to come along, and of course, I jumped at the chance. A few days later, we left for Cebu. If you've never been, Cebu is beautiful. Even now, I go back just to soak in the atmosphere whenever my mom and I visit Malaysia. Anywho, most of the trip passed in a blur, as it just consisted of me following my uncle to different venues and eating as much local food as I could. But eventually, it was time to head home. The drive back started out quiet and peaceful. It was late, and after the excitement of the trip, I was drowsy. You know those car rides where you can feel the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car pulling you into sleep? That is exactly what happened to me as I began resting my head on the seatbelt as I slowly closed my eyes to a deep slumber, until I woke up. There was a sound, knocking. Sharp, insistent knocks that jolted me awake. I was still in the car, but we were driving along a winding road on a mountainside, the dark trees closing in around us. I glanced at my uncle. His face was tense, and both hands were clenched on the wheel. Normally, he'd have the radio on, humming along to some tune, but now the car was dead silent. I heard the knocks again, this time from the back right window. The sound was too loud and deliberate to be pebbles or branches hitting the glass. I looked back, trying to make sense of it, but before I could fully turn, my uncle's voice cut through the air, cold and stern. Look forward. I froze. He sounded different, like he was barely holding back a tremor. He told me to keep my eyes forward, to look down if I had to, but not to turn around. My stomach twisted. Confusion and fear swirled together as the knocks grew louder, moving from one window to the next, each hit sharper and more insistent, like something was trying to get in. My hands clenched the seat, my body trembling as I felt the urge to turn around, to look, but my uncle's command echoed in my head. Then, as if on cue, the knocking escalated, pounding from every window. The sound became deafening, drowning out even the rev of the engine. My chest tightened, and tears started slipping down my cheeks as the car began speeding up, the engine roaring louder, trying to outrun whatever was out there. Then, silence. In an instant, the knocking stopped. The only sound left was my uncle's shaky breath and the low rumble of the car. I don't remember much of the rest of the drive. My uncle kept talking, forcing a conversation about school or friends, anything to distract us from what had just happened. But I could see it in his eyes. Beneath his calm mask, he was just as shaken as I was. Years later, I came back to visit my hometown with my mom, and one night, my uncle finally told me the full story. He explained that the mountain road we'd driven on was known to be haunted. He admitted that while I slept, he had seen something, a flash of black in the rearview mirror, almost like a shadow darting across the back seat. And just before I woke up, he'd heard it too, a whisper from somewhere behind us. It still gives me chills to this day that the warning never came from him. Story number 12. The Door. I lived in the Appalachian Mountains my whole life, where the woods are thick, tangled, and full of mystery. Growing up there felt like stepping back in time. We had no cell phones or gadgets to distract us. Just the endless expanse of forest as our playground and our imaginations as our guide. My best friend Madison and I would spend hours exploring the dense woods behind my house, following animal tracks, climbing trees, and discovering hidden creeks. In autumn, when the leaves turned fiery shades and fell, revealing clearer paths, we'd push a little deeper each day. We'd mark our bases in the most secret nooks we stumbled upon, pretending we were the first explorers to find them. But no matter how brave we felt, we always stayed close enough to see my house in the distance. Until one day, when the forest felt just a little more inviting, a little less ordinary, and curiosity got the better of us. We brought twine and other supplies, that day, winding it around tree trunks so we'd find our way back. We kept walking, deeper than we'd ever gone before, until we reached a strange old tree that split in two, like a giant slingshot rising from the ground. Right next to it, half hidden in the hillside beneath a pile of leaves and branches, was a rusty handle. As we brushed away the leaves, we realized it was attached to a heavy, wooden door, embedded in the earth as if it had always been there, waiting. Heart pounding, Madison and I both tugged on the handle, and the door finally broke open, revealing steps leading down into pitch blackness. Madison looked at me, unsure, but we felt compelled to go down. Maybe it was the mystery or the thrill of finding something forgotten, but we didn't hesitate. The air was thick and damp as we descended. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a cramped room. In the middle of the floor, lay a single, worn photograph. I held it up to our flashlight and froze. It showed two children, both girls, standing in front of a house that looked eerily like mine. The girls' eyes were so dark and their grins twisted, a little too wide. Madison and I looked at each other, panicked, and then bolted back up the steps, leaving the photo behind us. When we reached the top, we looked around. Our path of twine was gone, as if someone, or something, had unraveled it. We blindly ran back through the forest, finally reaching my house. We burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed. My parents immediately noticed something was wrong. We tried to explain what we'd found. The strange door in the hillside, the steps, and the photograph. My mom's face tightened with concern, but my dad, always the skeptic, shook his head and laughed. But when he saw we were serious, they agreed to come with us, though I could tell they thought it was just a kid's overactive imagination. With my parents in tow, we spent what felt like hours retracing our steps through the woods, following what we remembered of the path. We finally spotted the twisted, slingshot-shaped tree standing exactly where we'd found it before. My heart leapt, but when we scoured the area around it, there was no sign of the door. No rusty handle, no disturbed leaves. Just bare earth and untouched forest floor. It was like the whole thing had never existed. My dad muttered something about kids and their stories, but as we walked back home, I caught a worried look in my mom's eyes. Madison and I exchanged a glance too, and in that moment, we knew we'd experienced something no one else would ever believe. Even now, 15 years later, Madison and I can't shake the memory of that day. We've gone back to those woods more than once, trying to find any trace of that hidden door, but it's as if it never existed. We have no explanation for what we saw, no way to make sense of it. Every time I visit home and glance up at the woods, a chill creeps up my spine, and I almost expect to see the door waiting there, half buried and forgotten, just as we left it. And no matter how hard I try, I can still see that eerie photo in my mind, the eyes, the strange grin, like it's burned into my memory.